Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of I Like to Read with me, your host, Rachel Polanski. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you're a first-time listener. Maybe you're finding me because you listened to my conversation with author Lori Faria Stolars, which will be linked in the description. I filmed that a couple of weeks ago at the time of recording, at the time of this release. We may also be playing again. We may also be playing around again with the release dates. I apologize. My boyfriend / producer is going on a much needed vacation back to his hometown, which is also coincidentally near my hometown, but we met not here in Los Angeles. So he's taking a little bit of a vacation, and of course I like to read. Will still be recorded. I'll still be reading. Maybe I'll be using this time to post more on social media. So that's a big shout out to make sure that if you're not already, follow me on Twitter, which is actually just my own Twitter, rpolanski77. I, at this time, have yet to sort of converge them into separate identities because at this point, Twitter, I don't have a ton of followers, but it'd be great if you became one of them. I do have a separate Instagram, though, just for I Like to Read. I do have my Goodreads, which is I Like to Read. I have a Facebook page. I have this YouTube page. If you're watching, make sure you listen and give me a review on Apple Podcasts, especially, of course, it helps if you're subscribed on both Apple Podcasts and Spotify and YouTube, but a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts really means a lot and really goes a long way, so I would really appreciate if you did that. What else is new in my world? Sprained my ankle a couple days ago. I just was going on a hike, which I do multiple times a week, usually at the same place, so I'm quite familiar with the terrain. And despite being quite familiar, that doesn't make it apparently any less susceptible to falling, because I was walking actually not even on the rougher terrain hiking part of the trail. I was more just on the flat walking part of the trail, and just happened to take a little dip and fell right on my ankle. And I did twist my ankle quite a few times in college. Also, I think definitely a few times in middle school or high school, just due to sports. And of course, once you twist it once, you're screwed. There was a really bad time in college that I twisted it, and that was the last time that I had a injury that definitely, put me out of commission for a few days. Anyways, long story short, I'm really happy not only that my dad was here for the past long weekend for the 4th of July visiting, and I hadn't seen him in 19 months, and that was incredibly special. So it was a little lighter on the reading. It actually took me quite a few days to finish a few books as opposed to, my regular routine of 1 to 2 books every other day. It was taking 30 days to read one book, but it was awesome to spend time with him, and I was also really lucky that he was with me on that part of the hike. I was able to walk after, but it was quite swollen after. You don't need to see pictures. You don't need to see it. I'm hoping at the time of this release it will be fine, and I'm hoping if not in a couple of days it will be totally fine, but I'm definitely much better now than I was. But you're not here for my feet. I hope not, but if you are, maybe if that's something you're interested, we could work something out, let me know. But you are here for the 5 books that I have read this week, or the past 2 weeks, I guess. And the first one that I'm going to be talking about is Everybody Else is Perfect: How I Survived Hypocrisy, Beauty, Clicks, and Likes by Gabrielle Korn. So this is a nonfiction memoir. As the title would state, Gabrielle Korn is a young woman who was one of the youngest editors, if not the youngest editor-in-chief of beauty at Nylon. It's kind of crazy that her name has never come across, considering I read Nylon pretty heavily for a while, at least the online version for quite a few years during my boredom and woe and trying to find some sort of existential meaning at work. I, would peruse Nylon quite a bit. So she was very accomplished. She kind of rose to she rose among the ranks at Nylon, and that sort of inadvertently led her to become this high up position. And so with great power comes great responsibility. So as she's thriving in her work life, her personal life is definitely taking a toll. She is queer and out, and the relationships that she has with women are very complicated, mostly due to the fact that she also struggles with an eating disorder. And you can imagine, working in the fashion and beauty industry is definitely a hard place for anybody to work in, particularly somebody who has dealt with and or is in the process of dealing with body image issues. But of course, there's that facade of keeping up that everything's beautiful and perfect and always wanting the next thing and wanting to fit in with the models. And she's not actually a model by any means, but there's definitely a lot of Devil Wears Prada vibes in this. There's real life Devil Wears Prada, with the exception that you're kind of getting the Miranda Priestly side of things. But if Miranda Priestly was a young queer woman who was actually definitely more of an Anne Hathaway type personality, but sort of a hybrid, maybe, Emily Blunt's character, whose name is actually, I think, Emily. So it's kind of, she, as the Goodreads and the titles, the synopsis states, that she came out in the generation of the L word, which was a time when the idea of lesbianism and the idea of women as queer, power bosses, and expanding the idea of what a queer woman was beyond just sort of like the stereotypical like butch or femme lesbians that we often place women into when they are lesbian or queer. She develops her identity and explores her own gender identity, her own relationship to her sexuality, as well as her ongoing many relationships with other women. So it's very candid, it's very raw. There's definitely also, it's not a self-help book. It's not like a here's how to grow your career, but inadvertently, she definitely recognizes that she's privileged and also lucky to have gotten where she has gotten, but also she works incredibly hard. So it's a combination of both, timing and luck and talent, and, or, all three, I guess. But she's really a cool person. I'm now following her on all social media platforms because she's the kind of woman who has a story, and every woman has a story, but a story that really needs to be heard, that could definitely inspire a lot of women, people who are queer, feeling like they don't belong. Men can enjoy this novel, sorry, I always want to say everything is a novel, but half the time it's a memoir or a nonfiction book. This book, because that encompasses everything, is for everybody, especially a lot of the essays and memoirs that I've talked about on this podcast in the past. Things that come to mind are Roxane Gay, and things that come to mind, I'm like, what have I read? And just, I think a lot of a relatability in the sense that, like, she is around the age I am, I think a little bit older, but definitely just, a lot, while she's had objectively and subjectively a much cooler career path than I have. It just goes to show that, like, just because it looks perfect on paper doesn't mean it is perfect behind the scenes, and she's happy to sort of tear down that wall and show you her most vulnerable parts in an incredibly well written, you can see her talent shines through, and just in the way that she writes as well is just incredibly, the story it's kind of tells itself, but it's also just so well written, in the way that she puts her heart and genuinity, that's not a word, I don't know, maybe it is, into it, very good. Very nice. And our next book, which is actually a novel, is called The Lost Shtetl by Max Gross. This came out October 13th, 2020, so a little bit of a sleeper, oh my gosh, 6 months ago. And I discovered this because I actually, in my spare time, continue to run a monthly book club for the Jewish synagogue that I used to work for. And of course, I always choose a book with a Jewish theme. Sometimes it's a little more overt, sometimes it's a little more subtle. This one was actually recommended by a member of the book club, and as soon as she recommended it, I happened to see it was available at the library, so I got it, read it in a couple days, and was really impressed by it. So it's called as I mentioned, it's called The Lost Shtetl. And it takes the idea of what happens if this small little shtetl village in Poland remains untouched by the Holocaust and then suddenly has to re-enter today's present day world. So it kind of takes this mystical, supernatural, of course, there's an element of believability that you have to suspend, because it is virtually impossible that an entire shtetl, and we're not just talking a few Jewish people, I mean, it is sort of this mystical fairy tale village in the woods, and they're sort of trapped in this shtetl, like early 1900s, they have mail, they don't have mail, so they have, they don't have electricity, they're very like old school village, but self-sustainable. Through circumstances, a couple of the village ends up leaving, and then our main character, whose name is Yankel, what's his last name? Yankel Lewenkoff. Yeah, he's our main character. He's sort of the village outcast. He is the kind of guy who they're sort of, in their minds, is, spareable, and he's sort of dispensable. So he follows this couple out into the real world. And I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but from there, the novel takes quite a few different directions. So we continue to stay with some of the residents of the town, this Lost Shtetl, which is named Kreskel, and we see how they are adapting with the presence of the new world. And learning about the Holocaust is certainly an element of this, and trying to accept the fact of this great situation, and understanding that, like, you were spared by some mysterious accident, while still understanding that the present world may not be completely right. You can't go from 0 to 100 necessarily, but there are elements that can help, and whether they're the outside world and the Polish government is a friend or foe sort of remains to be seen throughout the novel. We get to see Yankel both as he sort of is, his life in the village and the before. We then get to follow him as he enters the new world, and he's sort of our stand-in. He already is this other, which is clearly defined from the beginning, and for him to be the bridge that sort of connects this old world Kreskel to the new world, specifically Poland and Eastern Europe. And Yankel is just a really well-written, complex character. He develops a relationship, some form of a relationship with multiple people throughout the novel. And the way that these relationships twist and turn, again, because we're already in this sort of suspended disbelief alternate reality, because I suppose, the novel does lay out a pretty clear explanation for how this could have happened. I mean, it's definitely not any sort of mystical Brigadoon. It is Brigadoon in the sense that all of a sudden it's come into sight to these like present day people, but it's not necessarily any sort of magic. It's more of like the magic of error and hindsight and foresight. So it's a really cool, like, Twilight Zone-esque novel. I thought it was honestly going to be a little bit darker than it was. There are some darker themes. There's definitely, there's sexual assault and sexual abuse. There's a little bit of language. There's a little bit of, sexual graphicness to it, but there's not really a ton of, like, death. There's not a ton of, like, graphic violence beyond some of the domestic sex work stuff, but it's also, very well written in the sense that it serves the purpose of the story really well. I was, engrossed in this, no pun intended, because the author's last name is Gross. I was really engrossed in this novel. It's just a little over 400 pages, so it is a little bit longer, but when you're dealing with such a layered, mystical, fun concept, and you also are dealing with the history and the layers and the power that comes with telling this story, it's no easy feat, but I definitely think it was well done. And if you're looking for something a little bit off the beaten path and something that you might not normally pick up, but if you want to think about what would happen if there was a village that survived the Holocaust and all of a sudden has to enter the present day world untouched, then this is the book for you. And next, we are returning back to the present day. I mean, technically, I guess that was the present day too, but it's like the past and the present. So, like, again, very meta, very, very layered. But next, we're going to the present day, more or less, with Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason. This is definitely a little bit darker. Martha, as the title would state, is not a happy character. She is filled with sorrow and bliss. We know that there is, like, she's always known that something is wrong with her, and it's not so much something wrong with her in the sense that, like, oh, she's clearly the devil or possessed or she has this darkness about her. It's more, again, like a very three-dimensional, a very nuanced, imaginative, but also realistic depiction of depression and of the way that people can have their loved ones still care for them and be on the periphery of their lives and can maintain relationships while still having this internal sorrow. Martha sort of carries this long-term desire to both be a mother and also is completely repulsed by the idea of being a mother. So the fact that her sister is continually having children and sort of drowning in her marriage while Martha is, like, unable to vocalize the way that she's feeling with that. So she takes it out on her husband, and we get to see that, like, from the outside, we can tell that she's not making the right choices, but because Martha is our narrator and because she is so self-aware but also so unable to control her actions, she makes for a really fascinating portrait of the struggles of mental health that, again, people are really good at hiding externally, but after a while that facade can only go so far. And the extent that love and relationships and other people can be there, but also the way, how far they're willing to go and to what limit, because there is a limit for everybody and that limit is different. And, it's just, as the title states, there is a little bit of bliss. So it's not all complete depression, but there's levels of mania to, I'm not diagnosing her. And there's not really, there's hinting to pills and she goes to doctors occasionally, but it's not sort of like a mental health book. Like I said, it's much more about that sort of like malaise and the less definable elements of depression and mental health, that just because they aren't necessarily diagnosed in a DSM doesn't mean that they don't deserve recognition and at least, a story to be told that portrays a woman in everyday life, that not everything is perfect. And maybe that's going to be okay, maybe not. You'll have to read and see. Next, we have God Spare the Girls by Kelsey McKinney. So this definitely reminded me of a Lifetime movie, but in all the best ways possible. And I don't mean that in the sense of the writing at all, because it definitely was very well written. I just mean in the sense that there's two sisters and they grow up in this very religious community, and their dad is sort of this evangelical mega priest, and everything is great and they're the good daughters, and you can tell that something is going to go wrong, and it becomes pretty clear from the beginning of the novel that the father is having an affair, and then it's how all the members of the family deal with the ramifications. Now for the young girls, they are young teenagers. They are both dealing with relationships of their own, and they've sort of taken these abstinence pledges and pledged themselves to their father and the church while, their own beliefs were wavering to begin with, because that's a mighty pledge and set of beliefs to take on, along with the fact that their father, who is this godlike figure to not only them but this entire congregation, is not the perfect man that he is, but because it's a rural southern Texas town and not necessarily a coastal elite town, the way that they handle the situation is very different. And the girls are able to escape to this ranch that their grandmother owns for the majority of the novel. So they're able to maintain this distance from their family, not only an emotional distance because of what their father did to their mother and how their mother is choosing to deal with the situation and subsequently their relationship, but also the physical distance really allows the two girls to develop their own relationships, and the way that their relationships with their respective partners from the beginning of the novel changes throughout the course of the story, as well as their relationship with their father. So there's definitely a lot of comparisons in that sense. It's a lot, there's being a teenager sucks. Being a teenager is hard when you have to deal with all of this too, conflicting faith and conflicting family relationships and conflicting sense of self. It's a lot. So I mean Lifetime in the sense that there are sort of those elements of, virginity and for, coming of age. And it's a little soap opera-y, but I think it's intentional because also anything that sort of takes place in a Southern evangelical situation is so far removed from anything that I actually know that it automatically feels Lifetime-y and soap opera-y. But it's a slow burn. It's not necessarily a thriller in the sense that anybody dies or will they or will they not, burn down the mansion or get the money, but will this family come back together, and if they do, is it worth it, and at what cost, and who will they be when they do come back together, if they do at all. And last but not least, excuse me for all the water breaks, it's a hot one, and I did remember to turn off the air conditioner this time, so at least you get the better sound quality. Last but not least, we have Filthy Animals by Brandon Taylor. So this started out at first what I thought was just a collection of short stories, and then very quickly realized, and also just happened to then look at the synopsis, or the book cover summary, the book jacket summary, that it's a series of connected stories. So not only are these vignettes and little short stories, but they feature recurring characters, and they feature sort of a smaller inner community and then a peripheral community, and the people in that smaller community, we get to see them told not just once, but at different points in their lives and different perspectives. So it's all about a group of young people in the American Midwest, specifically young creative people. Three of our main characters are in this complicated love triangle. Two of them they're all dancers in one way or another, and dealing with their relationship to the arts and whether or not that can become a feasible career is a long-standing story in it. There is a lot of different couples and different individual people on the periphery. I would say that there are main triad, but then there's different people that we get to see in different stories surrounded by their life. I think it's just a lot of what it means to want something in the very deepest sense of longing and intimacy, as the title I think is taken from that line from keep the cash, you filthy animals, from Home Alone, which is also taken from an older film. I think that it's very, filthy animals in the sense of humans really are these disgusting, filthy animals. And what does it mean to show your filth and vulnerability in the rawest sense while still being somewhat grounded? I know that sounds very scary. And, sometimes when things are very raw and amorphous, it can be a little more experimental writing and a little more poetic and or, not as plot focused. But I would say there's definitely still a lot of forward momentum and enough captivating writing for people who are still maybe even turned off by short stories, this might be a good place to come because there's still a connecting thread. There's still sort of a conclusion at the end. You know, it's not like you're just, I know people's complaints with short stories are, I invested all this time in these characters just to have them die in 20 pages. So it's like, well, someone you're reading about on page 5, you'll also get to know at the end, but you'll get to see different cool people in between. So with that, we have another episode. In the books for you. Let me know what you're reading as always. Make sure you follow me on all my social medias linked below. Check out my conversation with Lori Faria Stolars. And until next time, stay reading.